The UFC's commentary booth has been on a steady decline for more years than I want to admit, and with nothing but below average to slightly above average commentators replacing the legends that cemented this sport, it would appear as though things aren't going to get better anytime soon. This is the current state of UFC commentary. Now this would be a pretty current state video if I didn't take us all on a much needed trip down memory lane. So let's start from the beginning. The real beginning. In the days before Joe Rogan's inhabited the earth and there were only future Fox News hosts to walk us through MMA fights.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. You're about to see something that you have never seen before. The Ultimate Fighting Challenge. I'm Bill Wallace, and welcome to McNichols Arena. Along with me is Jim Brown. Along with me also now is Kathy Long, 5-time world kickboxing champion. Kathy, what would be your strategy in here?
Ladies and gentlemen, I introduce to you the Brendan Fitzgerald, DC, and Laura Sanko of 1993. The first human beings in history to commentate for the UFC. Ironically, the woman was the only person on the panel with combat sports experience, being a world champion kickboxer. But even she admitted that she didn't know shit about this new cage fighting thing. There was this undeniable element of the unknown in the air, as if everyone in the building, including the commentators, were waiting for an explosion to happen. However, it wasn't until about 3 or 4 fights in that I noticed how disrespectfully boring the commentary team was as a whole. You had some of the most brutal violence ever performed on television going on right in front of these losers' faces, and you would have thought they were commentating The Notebook.
Fatigue got him, baby.
I think fatigue got to him. He went too hard, too soon, too often.
Look, I understand the nerves must have been pretty high having to work the first ever televised cage fighting event in history, but for Christ's sake, how hard was it to find someone with enthusiasm? They could have picked a random drunk from the crowd and it would have worked out a lot better than these 3 dipshits. Actually, 2 dipshits. The woman doesn't count. She's a seasoned combat athlete, so nobody should expect her to be shocked when somebody gets punched in the face. The other guys, though, they don't have any excuse. They just sucked. And they sucked all the way into 1994 when they were replaced with a slightly more enthused group of idiots.
We are in for an exciting night tonight, fellas.
I've never seen Jim Brown so pumped up, and we do a radio show together, and I know that. But I want to tell you something. I hope Ben Perry doesn't feel bad, because Ben was with us the last time. He wasn't with us on one, but Ben, as a martial arts expert, famed Hollywood stuntman, what are your thoughts going in tonight to UFC 3?
You know, Hoist Gracie's really becoming a household name, not just in the United States, but worldwide.
You know, for 2 complete nothings and a football player, these guys really did do what they could to provide a more enthralling commentary experience, but it just came off as sort of discount boxing commentary. It was as if the commentators were trained to pretend to be excited as opposed to actually being engaged in what they're watching. Now, obviously, we're talking about a company who in this part of the story was in the beginning stages of going bankrupt, so it's not like they could afford John Madden to call their fights. But with a sport so self-evidently destined for the stratosphere, a sport that essentially had the same basic structure as the WWE but with real violence, it was only a matter of time before somebody with the skills and the passion to bring life to a UFC fight would come out of the woodwork.
Only 2 losses to Shamrock, and Gracie takes on Mark Coleman, who was a winner in UFC 10 and 11, undefeated in the UFC. Now the 3rd member of our broadcast team, a member of NBC's sitcom News Radio, and a 2nd-degree black belt in Taekwondo. Right now, let's go to Joe Rogan.
Thanks, Bruce. I'm back here right now backstage. I'll be interviewing the fighters as they come out of the octagon, and I'll also be previewing the fights, the final fights in each weight division. I'll be talking to the fighters. We'll find out who's injured, who's going to be able to continue, and who's going to go in if we need an alternate. Anything we need to know, as soon as I find out, you'll know. Back to you guys.
Don't worry, folks, your contacts didn't stop working. That is indeed Joe Rogan. A man who could have easily made his living winning sexiest men under 5 foot competitions, but instead he followed his burning dedication to the sport of mixed martial arts. Now, unfortunately, again, we're talking about a company that wasn't making any good decisions, so logically they made Joe Rogan a sideline reporter. That's right, this fucking joke of a company put Brian Kilmeade in the commentary booth before Joe Rogan.
And now Jason is in Hoist's guard, it's called.
What does that mean?
Hoist has his legs wrapped around him, that's called in the guard.
Seema Foreskin didn't think for a second that a flamboyant comedian with a deep interest in martial arts might be a better idea than someone who doesn't know what a guard is. Can you imagine a football game where one of the commentators spends half the time asking how first downs work? I mean, seriously, Brian, you're commentating on a string of events that were set up for one guy, and you can't even bother yourself to learn the most basic aspect of his game plan. Either way, Joe Rogan was set to the side as a post-fight interviewer slash sideline analyst for the first 2 years of his career. A mistake more blasphemous than the first 12 companies that rejected Harry Potter. And one of the many reasons why Dana White proved to be one of the sharpest individuals walking this earth, but we'll get to that later. Because while Joe was sideline reporting for $7, there was another mystery character that had already been in the commentary game for half a decade that nobody could have predicted would become a UFC icon.
Past weeknights at 6 o'clock for highlights, features, and interviews. And recently, new Red Wing announcer, play-by-play announcer Mike Goldberg commented on what it would be like to follow only one team again after spending a couple years covering the entire NHL for ESPN.
To be detached from loyalty for the last 2 years was really different for me and difficult at times, because you want to have time to get to know the insides of the players, to tell the sidebar stories that are really, really attractive, the only stories that you find out if you're with the team all the time. And when you cover the games on a national basis, you're in, you're out, and we may do 15 Red Wings games in one season on ESPN, because obviously they're focused nationally all the time, but I may do 6 of them, and they may come 6 weeks apart, Steve. So you really don't get that feel, and I miss that. And that's the one thing that when I was in Chicago, and I know Chicago's a bad word to some people.
That's
right. But when I was there, I was able to have that kind of feel for the teams. And that's why that my family, my wife and I decided we'd like to get back into that situation where we had a home, we had a community, we had continuity, and definitely build a long career here.
Mike Goldberg was without a doubt the John Anik of 1997. And what he's talking about in this clip are his frustrations about not being able to properly commit to the hockey team he usually commentates for. The reason that's relevant is because he spent several years reporting for the legendary Chicago Bulls, including Michael Jordan's infamous three-peat from 91 to 93. And he was able to treat that team like it was his entire life. Unfortunately for him, a giant swinging dick known as ESPN was coming around the corner fast, ready to put everyone out of business. So poor old sentimental Goldberg was forced to accept that mainstream sports commentary was going national. And after 3 years of dealing with this tyranny, he chose to commentate cage fighting. It's honestly really stupid sounding on the surface. Like, why would you leave a really sweet gig with the fastest growing company on the planet for some completely unknown cage fighting organization that's struggling to exist legally? But the fact is, Mike Goldberg's brain was wired to one thing, and that is commitment. He wasn't trying to be just another interchangeable talking head that has nothing substantial to say beyond
The key for him is just trying to stay healthy.
Mike wanted to be free to be himself, and most importantly, he wanted the freedom to dive as deeply into the lives of the athletes as possible, which he would only be able to do in the UFC. Think about it, his goal was to commit to one team, but instead he gets to see all the teams compete on the same night and nobody misses a thing. He may have to fly to Japan one weekend and Hawaii the next, but it's always going to be the same event. No matter how deep the roster was, everything that took place in the octagon took place in front of Mike, and that's why he won in life.
Fatigue got him, baby.
I think fatigue got to him. He went too hard, too soon, too often.
That's it. Delivering big shots to Hugo Duarte, and McCarthy has stopped the fight. Tank is the winner.
The hiring of Mike Goldberg marked the first time in history where the commentator quality almost matched the quality of entertainment on screen. But as we all know, there was a vitally important piece of the puzzle still missing, and without any real income being generated from his sideline reporting, Joe Rogan was forced to quit the UFC in 1999. He continued to follow the sport closely as legends like Tito Ortiz and Vanderlei Silva began to cement their legacies, but he wasn't associated with the UFC in any professional capacity, and at that time, Joe was perfectly fine with that.
And he was like, "Do you want to do commentary?" I'm like, "I don't want to do commentary, man. I'm here to get drunk and watch people kick the shit out of each other. I'm not here to work."
It wasn't until befriending the smartest bald-headed in the state of Nevada that Joe Rogan was finally convinced to get back into the commentary booth, and not as some sideline reporter chick. Dana put him right where a comedian belongs, which is center f***ing stage. And immediately, the entire dynamic of UFC commentary changed. The blend between Goldberg's constant iconic phrases and Joe Rogan's prehistoric levels of hype created an atmosphere that John Madden himself couldn't replicate if you gave him a pound of blow and a double overtime Super Bowl. It's also hilarious to look at Joe battling his personal biases for the first time on live TV.
Like I said before, I think Chuck Liddell has the best takedown defense in all of mixed martial arts. And he's on his back right now. Back up. That's what I'm talking about.
And a knee eaten in the process.
That's very hard to do. What he just did is very hard to do.
Now, while it is true that Joe's really not supposed to be picking favorites, especially being the only guy on the panel who can identify double underhooks, but that's where all the magic comes from. The combination of expert analysis and everyman fanboyisms made us all feel like we were part of it. Unless, of course, you like the guy Joe didn't, but Joe was really good at liking the guy most people liked, so whatever. The point is, UFC 37.5 marked the first ever legitimate appearance of Joe Rogan, who at that point had zero commentary experience. Yet he took to the job like an absolute natty. And with him and Mike's powers merging together like fucking Goku and Vegeta, the stage was finally set for the UFC to go mainstream.
Combination. Diaz knocks down Robbie Lawler. And then it's all over.
Robbie Lawler.
And it's all over. Nick Diaz has knocked out Robbie Lawler. Goes in though now. And he goes down. He's down. And Chuck Liddell.
He is out.
Light heavyweight champion of the world. Chuck Liddell is the light heavyweight champion.
Unbelievable.
Down goes Palmer
Good
again.
knee, but knows how to get a left
Down
hook.
goes
Jens is out.
And
He's out.
over.
Unbelievable.
It is over. Joe
Unbelievable.
has upset Jens Pulver.
Mirko looks tentative, though.
A mere 23 events after the day Joe Rogan was hired, the UFC broke a miraculous 750,000 pay-per-view buys, more than tripling the highest selling pay-per-view from the previous company. And I firmly believe that Joe and Mike's commentary are responsible for a sizable chunk of that growth. Their voices turned highlight reel finishes into fucking movie scenes. Joe's depth of knowledge in the play-by-play made it easy for anyone to understand what was happening, especially in the grappling department. And because the UFC was this weird, ever-growing niche sport, there was so many new people watching every month who had no idea what the was going on, which is what made Joe's expert analysis essential. You could be watching the last half of the prelims, right? And then by the time the main card starts, you'll know enough about what's happening to properly enjoy the big fights. It was a monumental feat that Joe Rogan doesn't get enough credit for, in my opinion. MMA is not football or soccer. It's not one game being played the exact same way every time with very slight strategic variations. MMA is a sloppy, disgusting mixture of 8 completely different sports: wrestling, jiu-jitsu, boxing, kickboxing, Muay Thai, Taekwondo, karate, and of course, the ultra-effective judo. It took a rare individual in 2002 to be able to identify any tiny aspect of those practices in a split second's notice, while being contagiously hyped all throughout. Honestly, if you happen to become a UFC fan in the early to mid 2000s, you were extremely lucky, because pretty much every year subsequent to 2002 saw a massive upgrade in both fight and commentary quality. Joe and Mike developed an instant bond that extended outside of commentary, which only worked to amplify their chemistry on the microphone, and together, they developed into the most electric commentary team in sports history.
He's got it deep. It's all over. Unbelievable. Florian has submitted Joe Stevenson. Wow. Carwin back to his feet, but he looked a little stiff in the stand-up, and he's getting...
Like we said, second to none.
Oh! He front kicked him in the face! Absolutely right! Trying to finish. It is all over! Kick to the face! Anderson Silva remains the heavyweight champion! A front kick to the face!
For nearly 1.5 decades, Rogan and Goldberg carried the torch for UFC commentary. But as the sport grew up, the commentary team grew old. And just like football in the 90s, the UFC was exploding so violently that they started putting on multiple shows a month, turning 6 events a year into 31 events a year by 2012. It got so overwhelming for the Golden Boys that the UFC had to start hiring backup commentators to take some of the heat off.
I have been out there trying to lock up certain talent as we move on into this next chapter. We've come to a deal with Jon Anik, and Jon Anik will now start in January as soon as we launch on Fox. Ladies and gentlemen, Jon Anik.
At that time, nobody had a clue why Dana was making such a big deal out of some commentary guy no one knows. But as usual, Dana was playing 4D chess. He knew very well that his commentary guys were rapidly approaching their 50s. And with the company constantly ramping up productivity, the requirements of the commentary team ramped up right with it. The UFC had just landed a massive 7-year deal with Fox that put them on the same channel as the Super Bowl. So Dana needed a young gun that was capable of picking up all the non-pay-per-view fights and Fox-related events while Joe and Mike carried the spotlight. But he didn't just want some schmuck to be there for filler. Dana needed someone who could conceivably move up to pay-per-view when his A-team decided to retire. So he put all his chips on Jon Anik. And on the same day that the lightweight GOAT himself debuted in the UFC, Anik too began his journey to become the last hope for UFC commentary.
Meanwhile, back at the Legion of Dana,
Joe and Mike continued to cover pay-per-views and Fox specials. And for the first time in history, legally sanctioned cage fighting was brought right to America's living room. And America took to it like the descendants of Roman savages we are. The Fox deal made Joe Rogan so fucking famous that his presence in the cultural icon known as Fear Factor got tsunamied. And the importance of that cannot be understated. Literally everyone in America watched Fear Factor when I was growing up. We should have immediately associated Joe Rogan with Fear Factor when the UFC went mainstream. But the fact is, Joe's passion for the sport just brings out a different animal than having to host 7 suburban white people drinking horse out of a tea pitcher. Mike Goldberg, on the other hand, didn't exactly have a comedian's level of creativity. His phrases, epic as they were, became a bit stale after a decade and a half, especially with the development of multiple UFC video games featuring all of Mike's 4 phrases. So just in case you for some reason didn't feel the oversaturation of dialogue already, UFC Undisputed was there to fill that hole. And on top of that, the amount of pure commentary time he accumulated over his long-ass career created a vacuum of gaffes that would leave the biggest Dominic Cruz fan cringing.
And everybody, I'm Mike Goldberg. Welcome once again to the Ultimate Fighting Championship. The Ultimate Fighting Championship.
You own Jay Check and Klaja Gadelia.
BJ Penn, the prodigy, pardon me, the prodigy. But tonight, he faces what
Tito Ortiz says the Lions dance like the Cobra Kai. He doesn't like them.
It is all up. No, sorry.
Hardcore UFC fans looked at Mike Goldberg the way corporate people look at sugarless coffee. It's not delicious and it certainly doesn't have the same effect it had when you were an intern, but it's important and it's essential. Ask anybody you know that works on the 23rd floor of anywhere what it's like when the coffee machine stops working. They'll probably describe the office version of UFC 155, which is the first UFC pay-per-view Mike Goldberg missed in 15 years. Luckily for the UFC, a trap card they placed 3 turns before activated and summoned Jon Anik in defense mode, saving the pay-per-view commentary and sealing the fate of Mike Goldberg's career. You see, in many ways, Jon Anik is like Mike Goldberg's high IQ son that just is better than him in every way. It's not malicious or spiteful or anything, the dude's just better than Mike. The play-by-play is concise and knowledgeable, the iconic phrases actually change every now and then, and he literally has a face like the KOs are igniting a visceral boner. It's not like Joe Rogan's scrunchy, surprised dumb guy face, it's more mythical. Like the faces on the Hiroshima people when they realized it wasn't a guy falling off a tall building. That's Jon Anik's face when something important happens. He is simply a Duracell battery of a human being, and unfortunately for Mike, God bless him, from the UFC's financial point of view, he was starting to look more like stock Amazon batteries. Moldy, Fire Stick batteries, which is evil but kind of true at the same time. Let's be honest, the man needed to learn more words. I understand there's only so many ways to describe a left hook, but there's an infinite amount of ways to be excited about a finish. Regardless, Mike retained his commentary position immediately, and as far as the fans knew, they had their black coffee back. There was no reason to believe anything was in store for Mike Goldberg besides hilarious drug addict rumors.
Do you have a drug problem, Mike?
I absolutely do not.
All right, here's where we come to conspiracy theory time, because the next part of the story is half mystery, half fact, and I'm gonna make up the mystery. So after Goldberg called in sick to UFC 155, every measurable aspect of the UFC was improving. Competition, profit, production value, all of it. The only problem was that the Fertitta brothers, who own most of the company, didn't appear to share the same passion for the sport as Dana White. And to the shock and dismay of everyone who gave a shit, the UFC was sold by the Fertitta brothers for $4 billion in June 2016. A move that no doubt Dana, as he stated in an interview that he was certain the UFC would collapse without him and the Fertitta brothers running it.
But right now, and this might be arrogant, but it's truly what we believe, that we're the only guys that can do this. We're the only guys that can take this thing to where it needs to be. We're definitely the guys that love it, are passionate about it, and have the roadmap for where this thing's going to go.
You could say Dana was being standard corporate Dana here, but I don't buy that shit. I think Dana believed every word he said, and I think he still believes that he's the only thing keeping the UFC alive. Well, I hope he believes that. It's the truth, and we all know it. The second the UFC sold to Disney, the whole system snapped in half like the fucking Titanic. Dana's just doing his best to guide her down with grace at this point. And the first unfortunate shipmate to get thrown overboard happened to be our beloved Mike Goldberg. Merely 5 months went by under the control of Mickey Mouse. The fucking maids hadn't even finished cleaning the corporate office yet, and on December 1st, 2016, Mike Goldberg was informed that as of December 30th, he would no longer be working for the UFC.
When did you find out, Mike, that come 2017 that you would no longer be calling UFC fights?
Right around December 1st, I got the news that my contract would not be renewed. And so, I was given about a month's notice, and I had a couple of shows left. I had Uriah Faber's last show, which was awesome. I had the trip to Toronto, and then, of course, UFC 207 was my last show. So right around December 1st is when I got the news.
And so you said, okay, you find out December 1st, you still have Sacramento, and you still have 207 left to call. What was that like for you?
Characters revealed in times of adversity, and that's what drove me. And the most important thing to me as a professional was to continue to do the best I could do on every single broadcast.
Though Mike was incredibly professional about the whole thing, the truth is those pieces of shit fired a loyal, lifelong employee on New Year's Eve with a month's notice, knowing none of the viewership would drop because Anik and DC were a perfect replacement, DC having been hired 2 months prior. I'm telling you, that is bitch logic 101, and Mike Goldberg got monkey branched by the UFC. No warning, no 50 reasons why I don't love you anymore, just straight up dumped, only to be remembered with one event's worth of tweets about how much everyone misses Goldie. Can you imagine how painful that must have been for him? Joe Rogan gets a brand new group of pals to scream at violence with, and it's on the only relevant MMA format. AKA, if you want to watch the UFC, you either sit there and be jealous that you're not there, or you get back into college football. And even then, you're out of a sport to watch for 6 months out of the year. Just a brutal fate Goldie had to suffer with absolutely no appreciation for what he did for the sport. Didn't induct him into the Hall of Nothing. I said I had a conspiracy theory to fill the gaps, but just talking about it out loud makes me think Endeavor are just who didn't want to renew the contract of a man they believed to be old and unnecessary, completely disregarding the bond that Goldie created with fans for almost 20 years. Now we're left with what we had that faithful day: Joe Rogan, DC, and Jon Anik, and that's only if Joe Rogan shows up. No meaningful additions have been made to the pay-per-view commentary team aside from Lori Sanko and a zesty Brit. So I guess after all that storytelling, it's time for me to finally answer the question: what is the current state of UFC commentary? Well, if I could compare it to The Lion King, it would be the lonely conversation between Simba and Scar after the Stampede scene. Except instead of a young lion, Simba's a 67-year-old comedian who's been vacuum sealed in the year 2004. Or in other words, it's f***ing over, Johnny. Joe Rogan hasn't watched a non-pay-per-view prelim in almost a decade. And let's be honest, even if he did, it wouldn't make a difference. There's just too many fighters on the roster for his old noggin. Jon Anik still has some time left, but without a Joe, he's useless. Dominic Cruz is actually low-key funny as shit, but his serial killer energy simply doesn't match what's happening. DC is just some dude's uncle they gave a mic to. I feel like he should be eating potato chips and drinking an oversized Slurpee when he commentates. I've literally never seen someone take such a cool job as casually as him, and don't get me wrong, it seems like he is a really cool guy, but he just doesn't give a f***. and that bothers me. Michael Bisping won't stop blowing himself and telling terrible jokes, which sometimes makes fight nights unwatchable if you like sound. Laura Sanko is okay, but she copped way too much credit for being the quote-unquote first woman to announce a UFC pay-per-view. Well, if you remember that karate chick from earlier whose name I already forgot, she was technically the first woman to announce a UFC pay-per-view, and that was the mid-90s. So you're not special, Laura, and neither is your Now, who else is on there? Hang on. Oh, Brendan Fitzgerald. He is a fantastic third wheel or backup for John Anik, but like I said, unless they can figure out cloning machines before old Sleepy Joe's in a wheelchair, Fitzgerald's as good as Anik in the end. Basically, what I'm trying to say here is we need another Joe Rogan, which is a unique issue that wasn't present when Goldberg got fired. And I think the reason we didn't truly feel the weight of Goldie's absence was because we knew we had Joe to fall back on. It's horrible to say because Mike Goldberg is legendary status to me, but I can't sit here and pretend like he was carrying the show. Slash was the greatest guitarist who ever lived, but without Axl and the gang, it's just some homeless dude shredding for no reason. Joe Rogan is the fucking unreplaceable singer of the UFC, and until they can find another bald, eccentric entertainer to replace him with, we're gonna continue staring down the barrel of Anik, Bisping, and DC for the remainder of Joe's tenure.